So you've finished those first couple of tasks. You've created a problem statement, you've created a journey map and a visualization. So what's next? Well, you need to document your research. There are two elements to this. Firstly, you need to briefly explain how you went about doing your research, what approach you took, and you're going to make sure that you cite all of your sources, and you're going to use RMIT Harvard for that. It's pretty easy to use the template that was provided. You'll find that there's a whole heap of really great resources in Canvas that will help you understand how RMIT Harvard works. But next, where the magic really happens is in the second part of this exercise, the reflection activity. There is much academic research to support the idea that the keys to learning, and in fact being able to create great ideas from your learning, is reflection. But reflection can seem like a really scary thing. It really does take you outside of your comfort zone, but it doesn't need to be that way. One of the interesting things about learning is we have to get outside of our comfort zone to do it. As they say in sports, if it doesn't challenge you, it doesn't change you. But the trick is to make sure that whilst we do get outside of our comfort zone, we don't get so far outside of it that we end up in what I like to call the terror zone. Because if we're terrified, then effectively what happens is that we freeze, fight or flight. Adopting a reflective practice is one of the ways that we can move outside of our comfort zone into the learning zone. The trick, however, is to make sure that we don't only look backwards. Now, don't get me wrong, looking backwards is an important part of the process, but it's not the only part of the process, and it's not the most important part of the process. The next step is always looking forward and thinking about what the value of the insight was for you and how you might adapt or change the way that you approach your study or the way that you approach your business using the insight that you've gained. The next trick to think about for those of you who want to really succeed in this task is to remember that even though we call it reflective writing, what's really important here is reflective thinking. So it's not what you write, and of course you have to write, but it's how you think that really matters in this task. So with all that in mind, let's get started in the process. At RMIT, we're using the DEEP, D-I-E-P model, where you're asked to describe your insight, interpret it, evaluate it, and ultimately plan for the future. So with those things in mind, let's talk about the next step, describing the insight. This is the section where you should probably have the fewest amount of words. Effectively, all this is doing is providing your reader with context so that you can remember and your reader can understand what the insight was and the context in which you experienced it. Ultimately, as we know, insight is ultimately what's key here. The temptation can be, when you're doing reflective writing, to focus on the what, when, who, and where, the descriptive elements. But there's a real danger in doing this. Descriptive elements are not reflection. So avoid the temptation to just create a simple timeline. What's really important here are your thoughts and your feelings. So rather than focusing on what, when, who, and where, focus on why, what happened, how it mattered, why you made the choices that you did, and ultimately what the implications are for your future. So in the next section, we interpret that insight, really put it under the magnifying glass. At the very least, you need to explain why the insight is significant in general, but specifically to you. You need to discuss the questions that it raises, both generally and for you in particular, and try and make connections between the insight and the course, the readings, the materials that we're exploring in design thinking for business. To go really deep, you might explore things like the insight's meaning for you in particular, the factors that have influenced, formed, or informed the insight itself. For example, previous events or learning, your own individual personality type, the setting or environment that you were in when you had the insight, and the relationship that you have with other people involved in this particular issue. You might also explore the consequences of the insight. For example, how this piece of information or knowledge might change things for you. What other things you realized as a consequence, and the extent to which it causes you confusion, doubt, or some deeper understanding of previous knowledge that you bring with you into this course. Lastly, you can also think about whether the insight itself is valid or logical, what you might do to test it, the extent to which the insight's transferable or relevant to other situations you might find yourself in, or whether it inspires a new idea or an evolved understanding for you of some previous knowledge. Evaluating the insight is a really important part of the task. Start by thinking about how this can benefit your learning. Think about how the insight is useful for your coursework, not just this subject, but your program overall. And most important probably is think about the ways that this insight is relevant to your personal development. So now we get to my favorite part of the reflective process, planning. It's really important that you include a part that says how you might use your chosen insight either in this subject, your course generally, your future work, or some aspect of your private or professional life. You might find that there's real value in setting some behavioral or learning goals for yourself, or finding ways to develop strategies to learn the concepts or skills that you found challenging or that you found frustrating in some way. So if you take nothing else away from this little video than this, it's really important to ensure that you provide enough description about what you learn to provide context, but the vast majority of your paper needs to focus on the reflective elements, what you learned, why it matters, and most importantly, what you're going to do next. So let's take the opportunity now to pull this all together. The slide that you need to complete looks something like the one that's on the page here on the screen in front of you. Firstly, I haven't spoken about this yet, but please include your photograph and the name that you want to use in Classroom. Next, make sure that you give a brief narrative introduction to the process. Explain the approach that you took. Explain the choices that you made. Your group will be able to work with this going forward to identify how this might help in the group project. Explain the steps that you undertook. I've left plenty of space there. Feel free to diagram it out. I've taken the approach of, say, starting with some computer research, going to the library, having some thoughts, maybe having some constructive, empathetic conversations, then doing a little bit more reading and continuing from there. Lastly, there's the reflection section. You need to keep this very brief. There is not very much room here at all. But remember, this is design doing. Although we call it design thinking, it's design doing. And even though we call it reflective writing, it's actually the reflective thinking that really matters. At the end of this video, there'll be a list of some of the sources that might help you explore reflective thinking a little bit more deeply. Otherwise, I can't wait to see the work that you do.